Okay, welcome to the last session of the conference. We still have one of our panelists missing, but we will begin. And we will hope that Viral Acharya will join us shortly. That's the hope. Okay, so for this last panel, we have Poonam Gupta and Pravin Krishna, and they have both been introduced. So without further introduction, the way we thought we'll do this is we'll first start with the short sort of statements from the three panelists. Third one is still to join in their sort of core areas of specialization. These are all interrelated, even if they initially might not look that way. But then we'll try to tie up the whole discussion on economic reforms and broaden it. And hopefully, we can draw as we go on a lot of the expertise that we have on the floor. So with Poonam, we will begin with an overview. So Poonam, give us a little bit of an overview of how you see last 15 to 20 years have evolved in terms of growth. And then a bit about your own view of where you see India going in the next whatever 5 or 10 years you choose the period, but a little bit of futuristic. I think we did discuss quite a bit, particularly in the very first session, the state of the economy in, just during COVID, after COVID and all. But here let's start with a little bit longer view from the past and then projecting to the future. Pravin is on international trade, so I will come and ask him on international trade, and if Viral arrives by then he is going to talk a bit about digitization. That's his area of specialization, and so we have 3 experts sitting here as well. Poonam.
Sure. Thank you very much, Professor Panagariya. Really glad to be here again on the second day of this conference, the last session. Learned a lot and really enjoyed a lot. So let me take only a minute or so to talk about the very long term of the India's growth process. And it's coming from some work that I had done at the World Bank. It was a paper and a report called India's Growth Story. There we had looked at the data of India's economic growth and progress over the last 50 years. And I'll just mention a few stylized facts that came out of that exercise. So, despite all the things that we hear about India's growth performance in the short run, in the media, in conferences such as these, such as this one, when you look at the long term, you see that India's GDP growth and per capita income growth has slowly but surely accelerated. And it's the pace of acceleration has accelerated in the last 3 decades after the reform process that was initiated in the early 1990s. There have been some other features of this growth. One is that this growth has been accompanied more or less all through with macroeconomic stability, which means that if you compare India's growth experience with that of other countries in other regions, be they in Latin America, Eastern Europe, or to some extent the Asian economies in the 1990s, many of those countries, they have short periods of growth which are fueled in some ways by macroeconomic excesses, and then correction happens and growth slows down again. India hasn't had that. India has had in the last 30 years 2 short periods of volatility, and both of them emanated from the external factors. One was 2008-9 crisis that originated in the US, and the 2013 short taper talk, emerging market sell-off episode, which also started with the US Federal Reserve Board conveying that it would start to raise its policy rates, and it had an impact on India. So for most part, the growth has been consistent and stable. Other features of this growth has been that the share of agriculture in GDP has declined slowly. Share of services has picked up really very well. Manufacturing sector, which did well for some years but grew at an average rate of GDP, so its share in GDP has not accelerated, has not increased by a great deal. So that's really the long-term story. The story that I want to focus a little bit more is the last 7 or 8 years, where I have a little bit more data to talk about, and that period is more current in our mind. So let's look at what has happened in the last 7 or 8 years. Again, despite the fact that there has been one major shock, which we talked about yesterday in the first session of the conference, the growth has averaged about 6% in the last 8 years. And here the period is 2014 until this current fiscal year, which we are about to complete. Inflation has averaged about 5%. Current account deficit, and these are all indicators of macroeconomic stability. So 6% consistent growth rate in a once in a generation health crisis is not bad. Inflation contained at 5% is very good. Current account deficit contained at about 2% is highly credible, and so on. So these last 8 years, we have had high growth along with macroeconomic stability. But if we unbundle it just a little bit more and we look at what else has happened during these 8 years, and we can also relate it to some of the reforms that have been undertaken during these 8 years. GST tax revenues have increased at double digit. Tax to GDP ratio has started to increase after being stagnated for many, many years. External account has been stable. Exchange rate has again depreciated gently at times. Real exchange rate has been broadly stable, small appreciation but broadly stable. Fiscal deficit and debt levels have been prudent around high structural levels that I mentioned yesterday, which are deemed high within the region and within its asset class that India is in, but overall still prudent because of the way they are financed. Financial markets have done very well overall, and whenever they had to adjust, they have adjusted without any disruption. Financial sector, both bank and non-bank. When I said India has grown very well over the past many decades with no macroeconomic crisis in the last 30 years, I skipped the fact that banking sector actually did undergo a mini crisis, and it has emerged from it stronger than before. Non-bank sector has been doing very well now after a mini crisis that it encountered in 2019-20. And the variations around these performance indicators that I mentioned are also smaller, which means steady growth with macroeconomic stability and many other indicators doing rather well. I'll stop here.
Okay, Pravin, so your charge is international trade, and give us a sort of overview of where the policy has come from, where it has evolved in recent years, and again, where you see it going.
Great, thank you. Thank you again for inviting me to participate in the panel. Just in terms of the trade policy, the background, the motivations for trade policy in India, one thing to keep in mind, kind of the backdrop here, is, and this would be known to most of you, is the broad problem of structural transformation of the economy. So you've got an economy that is very heavily reliant upon agriculture, in the sense that a very large fraction of the labor force is engaged in agriculture. The natural driver, in a sense, of development, the growth trajectories one would have imagined would have been out of agriculture into manufacturing, perhaps manufacturing into services, certainly some level of transition from agriculture into services. This is one economic feature that's out there that sort of motivates thinking in this area about trade policy as it relates to manufacturing and so on. The second big piece is Indian demographics. So we've got a very young country, many millions of people entering the labor force. So there's a bunch of different estimates of how many new jobs need to be created every single year. That number is about 10 million workers every year. And essentially that means in about 10 or 15 years, you have to create enough jobs that is equivalent to the entire labor force of the United States. It's a very, very large task. So there's a question of how much is manufacturing growth going to do in order to kind of create these jobs. And in turn, once one sort of looks at these two issues together, the international market seems like a very obvious place for us to be looking for the kind of the obvious reason again that the Indian middle class and the levels of consumption that they can support, whatever those numbers might be, they're estimated to be about $500 billion. It's a very, very small fraction relative to the overall global markets that India could be part of. India currently, in terms of its own exports, is probably about 2% of global kind of consumption of world export markets. And so that's a very natural space for us to be looking at in terms of growth and how we get there. In terms of trade policy and just the history of trade policy, it's a bit interesting. India was a founding member of the GATT. So in the 1940s already, we were sitting at the table, the big table, where international trade rules were being negotiated and so on and so forth. And despite the fact that we were the founding members of this kind of the original agreement under whose support, really, world trade grew tremendously from the 1940s through the 1980s, 1990s. As the world was liberalizing and as international trade was growing, India was going exactly in the opposite direction, right? So we had higher tariffs. We went from a relatively liberal trade regime in the 1950s, perhaps to, as everybody here knows, a very nearly autarkic regime by the 1980s and so forth. And there's a kind of an issue of bad timing in terms of Indian trade policy, at least in my view, that just as we had started to fully realize the consequences of our bad economic decision-making of the past in terms of international trade policy as we got to the late 1980s, early 1990s, and we were ready to liberalize our trade regime and do more and be more integrated with the rest of the world. The US and other countries, major players in the kind of the world trade system, were starting to move away from the multilateral architecture that they had put in place. The US was already distracted by free trade agreements with the Canadians in 1988, the North American Free Trade Agreement by the mid-1990s, and so on and so forth. So the focus of the United States moved away from the GATT WTO system just as we became more interested, in a sense, in that. Take that discussion another 20 years forward. Now we've got a whole bunch of reforms that we've undertaken that in principle would be very good to support our kind of international trade footprint, easing of FDI rules, really dramatic improvements in infrastructure in the country on multiple different dimensions. I think doing business with indicators for what they were, certainly whether one sort of fully buys into the big jumps that the World Bank had previously reported for India or not, there's certainly a significant improvement in ability to do business in India. But we're kind of, now, once again, we're at this kind of globalization party at a time when potentially the global mood for globalization has actually changed again, right? So if you look at what's going on in Washington, and this is perhaps a bit of an exaggeration, but if there's one thing that Democrats and Republicans agree on is that they both don't like China, and two, that they both don't like international trade, okay? That is the mood of the moment, and just as we're kind of in this, where we've reached a very interesting point in our own trajectory where we potentially have, a growth possibility ahead of us, the international mood at some level has soured. I take that back a little bit because when you take these 2 points together about Washington's appetite for greater engagement with China and then international trade, there is this other possibility of substituting away from China towards India, the China plus one model and so forth, and we can talk a bit more about that. But at some broad level, there's kind of, here an issue of kind of bad timing a bit with historically looking back, that we're arriving at parties just as, in a certain sense, they're ending. What is the state of trade policy today? What are we doing in terms of capitalizing on the moment, in terms of our own, where we are, in terms of other reforms that have taken place, FDI, infrastructure, and so forth? I think the messages one gets out of New Delhi, they're a little bit mixed, at least from my perspective, in terms of what I see. On the one hand, as was discussed in a couple of the sessions yesterday, and Devashish pointed this out as well. If anything, on the unilateral trade policy side, there's actually been an increase in tariffs, and I think several thousand tariff lines over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, tariffs have increased. The average tariffs have gone up, not a whole lot, but certainly the movement has been in the wrong direction, from about 15% to 18%. It's not quite clear what is motivating these changes. It's not quite clear if these were, there's a revenue motivation to raise these tariffs. And because it's not clear what we should expect in the future, right? There was no particular argumentation given, at least that I'm aware of, as to why these tariffs were raised, and therefore it's hard to forecast what the structure of tariffs might look like in the future. Simultaneously, there's the question of kind of bilateral policy, right? So the WTO is in a very bad place, so multilateral trade negotiations are probably backburnered for a while now, and that leaves you've got unilateral, you've got multilateral, and you've got bilateral. And here there's an interesting sort of change. So first of all, India is already part of a number of different trade agreements. I would say at least a dozen trade agreements or so. Most of these are actually quite shallow agreements, right? So there's relatively little that has been liberalized. These agreements have had, because of India's sort of special status as a kind of a developing country in the world trade system, it's been able to negotiate trade agreements through a separate window, the enabling clause of the WTO, which allows you to negotiate sort of partial trade agreements, roughly speaking. And because of that, it's in a sense, India's exploited that in the past to get into trade agreements that were relatively modest in their scope, in their depth. You've got very few meaningful kind of tariff line liberalizations that have taken place. And where there was more substantial liberalization that was intended, it was also put it was not front-loaded, it was back-loaded. So the agreement gets signed in the year 2010, 2011, and the liberalization is actually supposed to take place maybe 8, 9, 10 years later, right? So we're yet to see the consequences of all of these trade agreements to the extent that we've actually studied it, and Arvind and I have a couple of pieces on this as well. It's been an extremely modest record in terms of what we've actually achieved under our existing free trade agreements. They've hardly moved the needle with respect to neither imports nor exports or anything else. So it's not clear. It's fairly clear that the agreements that were signed in the past have not been as effective as we would have hoped. That said, it seems like there's a new energy, positive energy, towards more liberalization in the context of free trade agreements, and this seems quite genuine. So I've involved in discussions in the past in Delhi or talking about RCEP or various other things. There's always significant voices of opposition to these deals. But now, as you're looking at the India-UK free trade agreement that's being contemplated, the India-Australia free trade agreement that's already done, India-UAE, some discussion about reviving much more substantially, which has already taken place, reviving more substantially the India-EU free trade agreement as well. I feel like there's something positive here that's taking place, and I think it's worth pursuing. The multilateral system is not going to give us very much in the short term. Unilateral trade policy is what it is. If we can somehow actually achieve meaningful liberalization with larger economies, the EU, the US, if this kind of liberalization is also achieved locally, it will allow India to have a better sort of export footprint. It will make us more efficient in multiple dimensions. There's this big question about global value chains and what we could do with that. It's very clear that to enter global value chains and do so efficiently and actually exploit what arrangements there are out there, you also need to have a very efficient import regime, right? So you cannot have high tariffs, variable tariffs, inefficiencies on your import side and expect to be an efficient player with a large footprint on the export side, especially in the context of global value chains and so forth. So I hope there's going to be a fuller recognition of that and a fuller understanding of that. And if these things are achieved, if you have a more rational kind of structure on the import side and success in engaging in free trade agreements with some of the larger economies, I feel quite optimistic. I think we're at a good point in a sense of possibilities and potential. How much we're able to take advantage of the geopolitics of the moment, which is the last thing I'll talk about for maybe a minute. So there's the obvious kind of geopolitical shifts in kind of mood and landscape last few years. A question of how much we can take over markets that sort of businesses that are either vacating China or businesses that China is vacating itself, right on the lower end of the skill distribution. And on both these counts, until now, the issue has been, I think it's definitely not a record that one could be super proud of, right? It's not a total zero, but yet things like textiles, I think some statistics were shared yesterday by Poonam in her presentation and by Mary as well in her discussion of Devashish's paper. Other countries, Bangladesh, Vietnam, etc., have done as well, in fact, in some areas better than India has. And I think this leaves us a lot of room for introspection on what we could do better. There are certainly things that we could be doing better on, and I hope that we're able to take advantage of this opportunity. The very last thing I'll mention, maybe we could talk about it in greater detail, discussion is one of the other points that comes up now as a kind of a change in policy, very recent change in policy in India, is the PLI scheme, which is the production-linked incentive scheme. This is quite ambitious, a huge budgetary allocation, 5-year program, over $30 billion have been committed. And the idea is to incentivize large players, both domestic, international, through, in a sense, production subsidies, to come to India or to expand their production in India in particular sectors that the Indian government deems as being important. So the entry of Apple, the expansion of kind of mobile phone production in India, a whole bunch of that is through this particular scheme. One can have, there's kind of multiple views about what exactly is going on under PLI. I should say that quantitatively, in terms of the actual investment that's come in terms of the number of jobs that are recorded as having been created under the scheme, these numbers have exceeded my expectations, right? Although there are others that look at the broad goals that were announced by the Indian government at the time that this policy was rolled out, and they look at the record today of what was actually achieved in relation to this, and they're a bit disappointed by where things stand. But I have to say that the numbers themselves have exceeded my own expectations. There's certain nuances about this policy that we could discuss more generally once we get to maybe Q&A or broader discussion. Yeah.
Okay, so number of things you have said, Pravin, and I want to come to those. But first, let me just say how it looks. So from Poonam, what we have largely the story of macroeconomic stability. From Pravin, we have an opportunity seems to be there for India opening up on the global side. Geopolitics seems to be favorable in the sense that India has this intense desire to move itself away from China. Now, India has a very large bilateral trade surplus with China. Economists don't think a whole lot of bilateral surpluses or deficits. Sorry, so India has a bilateral trade deficit, very large one, with China, and so as economists, we don't think much of bilateral deficits or surpluses. But politically, I think this has a lot of salience. So there is a desire for that reason, as well as for the fact of border conflict to move away from China. And that, I think, to some degree explains the move towards free trade with countries that India sees as friendly countries. So that is Australia, UAE, now currently United Kingdom, European Union. Some kind of negotiation is on, so that will take a while if it is to move forward. So in any case, putting the two together looks to me that situation is good, and as some people are characterizing it as India's movement and so forth. Maybe Poonam, if you would tell us what you think is our prospects of India If you wish to also talk about what India still needs to do to achieve those prospects, decide whichever way you want to slice it out. But just a little bit of futuristic on how you see things to evolve.
Sure. So let me address this issue in a couple of different ways. One is in a cross-country perspective. When you look around the world and you look at episodes when countries had accelerated growth or when they had growth slowdowns, and you look at the reasons why those episodes happen. Particularly for growth slowdowns, they would be correlated with either the way the economies were handled or with some structural factors. The structural factors could be aging population, demography. It could be political instability. It could be the fact that a country depended on one or two sources of growth. These could be natural resources, and there would be a terms of trade shock which would then impact growth. And it could be, again, the same old thing that I've been talking about, macroeconomic stability, for which we don't need to look at a place very far. We can just look at our own neighborhood in South Asia, look at what's happening to Pakistan and Sri Lanka. And so these are the various reasons why growth often slumps down. And when you look at India, none of these factors actually exist. We are talking about political stability. We are talking about a young population. Demography is not going to impact us. It's a large and diversified economy to the extent that when global shocks happen, they do impact the country, but then there are enough checks and balances in the sense that if one sector slows down, there are others which can still carry the economy forward. Macroeconomic stability we have already talked about. So all of these structural factors, along with the policy management, implies that India can easily grow at 7% in coming years. Now, for some people, 7% may look very ambitious. For others, it may not be good enough. Just remember, until a couple of years ago, we were talking about 8 to 10% growth rate. So 7 is a much more reasonable number, down from that 8 to 10%, and it accounts for the fact that a COVID has happened. It accounts for the fact that globally situation is not looking as promising as it was looking before COVID. A number of factors will impact the global growth. So taking into account all of those, 7% growth rate for nearly a decade, if not longer, is absolutely looking like a reasonable scenario. But I would say that there are reasons to believe that India can do much better than that. And why do I say that? This growth rate that we have seen, the growth record that we have seen, has come from only half the population participating in the economic activity. Women have not even stepped out to work. So we have all that cushion still with us, and I feel that there has to be a wage level at which women, despite all the cultural norms and safety issues and childcare issues that you talk about, will step out and will contribute to economic activity. So India still has that labor force and that talent and entrepreneurial skill still there in reserve in a way. The other reason is all of this growth has happened despite the fact that India has not integrated meaningfully on trade with the global economy, something which we all are hoping will happen in going forward. This growth has happened despite the fact that India has not attracted so far FDI at levels that other countries in East Asia have been able to do. With all the policy reforms that are happening in India now, including the infrastructure push that is coming, I would be really surprised if it does not also result in greater amounts of FDI coming to the country. A last lagging factor which will actually give us an extra spurt of growth going forward is the manufacturing sector. So in the last 3 years, I showed some data yesterday, manufacturing sector has grown only at 1.7% a year. And this year, actually, it's almost flat. Manufacturing sector growth is only 0.6%. Now, again, because of all the reforms that have taken place, this push to infrastructure, improvement in business environment, a young population, low wages, manufacturing sector has to do well. So there are all these pockets of untapped opportunities that are still ahead of us. So when I say 7%, I would say 7% is based on the drivers of growth that have driven growth so far. But if we can also leverage all these untapped opportunities, we can certainly grow at a much higher rate. Having said all of this, getting growth is a lot of hard work. Continuous policy reform and implementation will have to happen in order for us to achieve 7 and beyond.
Okay, so a lot of good stuff there. I'll come to some of that, but first just one specific one. There's a lot of, this assertion one sees on investment, that somehow the government, but the public investment is rising and that's what is carrying on the investment. What do you see on private investment particularly?
So, two parts of this question, Professor Panagariya. One is public investment. So there has been a welcome turn around in public investment, especially in the quality of our fiscal spending that has improved. There is a definite shift away from revenue expenditure to what is called capital expenditure. There is a definite shift towards more infrastructure spending, and there is better outcomes that we are getting for the same amount of spending. There is better spending also in how public services are being delivered and so on. But let's face the fact that public investment is still only 6 to 7% of GDP. And private investment is close to 27, 28% of GDP, if I'm not wrong, or a higher number this year, depending on if you look at current prices or constant prices. So there's only so much that public investment can do to take the rest of the 93% of the economy with it. So there is no alternative but for private investment to accelerate. Now, private investment has been subdued in the country for nearly a decade, or it was subdued for nearly a decade, right after the global financial crisis of 2008-9. And the reasons for that slowdown has been discussed in detail across papers and media articles. And there were basically 2 or 3 reasons. One was over-investment during early to mid-2000s. Second was that banks had lent somewhat, non-judiciously to certain sectors. Corporate balance sheets were stretched. Now, when I talked about a mini banking crisis, there was also the issue of corporate balance sheets. Now, all of that has been cleaned up. That process actually completed around 2019-20, right before COVID hit. So last 3 years have been taken over, first by COVID and then by global situation. Otherwise, we would have perhaps not just seen a more definite turnaround in private investment, but perhaps would have also researched and seen where this increase in private investment is coming or is likely to come. So to sum it all up, public investment is absolutely welcome. The turnaround in it is great, but unless we also get much higher private investment, it would be hard for us to see the kind of growth rates I'm projecting, 7% and above. One last bit is that we also need to pay enough attention to FDI. When we talk about private investment, it can be domestically funded private investment. It can also be investment attracted from abroad in the form of foreign direct investment. Now, foreign direct investment plays a number of useful roles, as they have done in other countries, including in Vietnam. So if you compare the data of Vietnam with India, it's really striking that the amount of FDI India gets as percentage of its GDP is about a quarter of what Vietnam gets, 2% versus 7 to 8%. So what does FDI do in today's world? It provides access to capital, technology, market, and knowing consumer taste globally. So it helps you connect with the global market as well. So I would say private investment, both domestic and foreign, is what we need. Thank you.
Thank you. Pravin, so let's get to some of the global side of this. how do you see the particularly, I think, foreign investment is where Poonam left, and that's where perhaps one can try to pick up. On this whole issue of China plus one strategy, right? Where do you see India kind of succeeding? That the general impressions go over a wide kind of range of things, from no action to very high hopes. Reality at present seems to be somewhere in the middle, and certainly we have seen some big things happen, meaning that Foxconn in particular has now made a decision to come to India. Some of it is already here, but bigger, even larger movement of a lot of the assembly activities that Foxconn and other suppliers to Apple seem to be on the horizon. And it is probably true that if this global link has to happen, at least my sense is that you need a much bigger play of the multinationals. The fact that there is a lot of desire on the part of a lot of multinationals to move out of China clearly offers the opportunity. Question is that how much of it can come to India. And in particular, you see, the reason I say that this is so very important is that, as you mentioned, the Indian share in particularly the merchandise exports still is below 2%. China is at about 12 or 13%. We'll certainly in India probably never get to anywhere near where China is, but even to get to 4 to 5%. Domestic firms really tend to be relatively smaller and therefore don't integrate so well in the global marketplace and look more to the domestic market. And a lot of the import substitution that has happened even in the electronics industry due to increased protection, a lot of the sales of the domestic firms at least are concentrated in the domestic market. So ultimately this link to the global marketplace, particularly in these kinds of electronics area, which offers very large opportunity if you can really take over the market. It's a very, very large market. But I don't want to ignore some of the others as well, from the labor-intensive sector, apparel and like footwear and furniture and a lot of the other light manufacturers. Means there's a broad set of possibilities for India to capture that kind of market. Even apparel itself is about $500 billion, $500 billion export market. So it's not a small market. So I think that's where seems to me ultimately a big part of the momentum for growth has to come.
No, so first of all, I completely agree that that's where the momentum for growth should come. I also agree that that's where it could come, in the sense that we're finally, the Indian economy, given all of the reforms that have been undertaken over the last 10 years or so in particular, have positioned us extremely well to maybe take advantage of this opportunity. That said, I have sort of mixed thoughts on this for the following reasons. One, on the plus side, if one looks at the success stories, and we've talked a bit here as well yesterday about Bangladesh and Vietnam having done extremely well in taking over some of these market segments that China was vacating and so on, or just in general. It's not as if what Bangladesh did or what Vietnam did in terms of either reforms or structural changes or human capital or anything else is so extraordinary relative to what we have or what we could be doing, right? At some level, actually, let me take away a little bit. I'm a little more skeptical about the Bangladesh growth story and the Vietnamese story relative to some others, but let me explain why. Bangladesh has duty-free access to the European Union through the Everything But Arms agreement. It's actually about to lose that duty-free access because it's gotten too rich to qualify for this access. If you look at the big export story of Bangladesh, it's in textiles, and most of those textiles are going to the European Union. Okay, and once that duty-free access is shut, that picture is going to change very rapidly. If you just look at Bangladesh exports to the EU relative to the US, there's a very big difference. Okay, so my point there is to say that there are some sort of features of policy that have enabled Bangladesh to do as well as it has over the last decade or so. But outside of that, I don't see anything that they have in Bangladesh or Vietnam really that India does not have. So in principle, that's a strong positive if we're able to, get our act together in some ways, and we seem very well positioned to do that. That's a great thing. One of the choke points I see is our economic engagement with China. So in a sense, if we are to enter the global value chains in a variety of industries in which we're interested in, there's a real challenge of what it is that we're doing with China here, right? On the one hand, there was already, before the conflict in Galwan in 2020, there was already a bit of a concern in India about expanding and exploding trade deficits with China. That's one of the things that motivated India's exit out of RCEP, I believe, in November of 2019. But leaving aside the trade deficits, now it looks, just from a geopolitical sort of standpoint, it looks highly improbable, given the border conflict and the intensification of the border conflict, that we're going to engage in sort of deeper economic relationship, trade relationship with China. And if you don't do that, then where are you with respect to the entire ASEAN, Asia-centric, how successful are you going to be in getting businesses away from China towards yourself? That's a question mark for me. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. On the plus side, again, I think whatever the costs, the subsidy costs that India is paying through the PLI scheme to incentivize large players like Apple to come to India, I think there's something very positive there nonetheless, which is that even if it's just a cost that you're paying purely in terms of achieving some sort of a demonstration effect to international suppliers in the world, that you have high-tech manufacturers like Apple, various others, Foxconn, and so on, that they're all here. Maybe this is a signal to the rest of the world that we're open for business, we're ready for business in a better way, more substantial way than we were in the past. Only time will tell how many other suppliers are going to sort of follow this lead and come to India. So for me, it's not all sort of different things pointing in one direction. There are signals that are very positive. There are things that move us in the opposite direction. It's also the case that we're looking potentially at a global sort of growth slowdown, just from a kind of a macroeconomic standpoint. The U.S., there's constant worries about an impending recession, possibly similar kind of macro outcome in the European Union as well. And so that's going to, if we're talking about greater demand from the rest of the world, or worsening demand from the rest of the world, what is that actually going to do to India's prospects? Let me say as a final point that, and you've made this point multiple times, Arvind, this is a very good one, which is regardless of the global fluctuations of demand, that our market share in the world is so small that certainly there's room to improve. So from 2%, even if kind of global growth slows down for a bit, we should be able to do better.
Okay, so that's about having a larger slice of the pie. This global market actually has been not only very large, but it continues to grow. Pre-COVID, the merchandise export market peak was in 2018, which was 19 trillion. Today, that figure has gone to 23, 24 trillion. So it's very large, and what India needs to do is, this is the argument I've often made.
Yep.
On PLI, I want to push you a little harder. Now, you have noted the positives. Right, even in terms of employment and all, jobs creation. But when you are subsidizing, you're say the term used commonly is incentivize, right? So you're incentivizing 7 or 8 or 10 different sectors at once. That is roughly the number of sectors to which the PLI is available. Now, when such a large section is being incentivized, for anybody who is left out of those incentivized sectors, it's effectively a disincentive. So inevitably there is an impact, I would think, on the other sectors. And this is a point that is often missed. It is difficult, it is missed also because it's more difficult to nail down, because these effects are spread all over the remainder of the sectors. and with everything else changing, you can't associate, what part of this change is due to the PLI. But inevitably it's there. So, while jobs may be getting created here, they may be getting lost there. Capital, particularly what the PLI does is to move capital into these incentivized sectors. But then, of course, it's moving out of somewhere else. Because even, ultimately in terms of capital inflow from abroad through foreign investment, etc., is largely capped by how much current account deficit the central bank is willing to run. And it's not willing to run more than a couple of percentage points of GDP every year on a long-term basis. So that, the inflow of foreign capital is pretty much capped by the current account deficit. So it's really the domestic capital. So therefore, the pie is fixed. And so if you're moving capital into these sectors, you're moving it out of some other sectors. And it is entirely probable, particularly if the PLI sectors also happen to be the protected sectors, tariff-protected sectors, then what you're doing is you're moving basically capital out of the more efficient sectors, which are outside of the PLI and protection, into the sectors that are actually less efficient sectors. Is that not a source of worry?
That is a source of worry, and let me add to the worries with this, actually more at a micro level before we look at the intersectoral issue of allocation of capital one sector to the other. So PLI is a production subsidy, and in designing the PLI, it's my understanding that India had to sort of think very carefully about what type of subsidy it could actually put in place that was WTO legal, because you can't just automatically subsidize exports. That would be WTO illegal. You cannot subsidize on the basis of domestic content. That would also be WTO illegal, right? So in the end, they said, let's have a very, very simple, non-complicated subsidy, which is just, top-line subsidy. You sell above what you were, so you produce above what you were producing before, and we're going to subsidize all these kind of new units of production by 4 to 6% or something like that. Now, one of the issues why is this a worry? One of the reasons that this is a worry is that the subsidy is not on a value-added basis. It's not given to the value added that's actually taking place. So let's take the Apple iPhone production example, right? How much value added is actually taking place in India on the Apple iPhone? Maybe 5%, maybe less, right? But let's call it 5%. And in effect, if the Indian government is paying, let's say, a 5% subsidy for the iPhone, it's as if it's paying the full cost of all of the Indian value added, right? So for Apple, this is free inputs from what's going on. And so this is just directly, essentially you're saying Apple, just send us your wage bill or whatever it is, and we're going to pay it for you, right? So it's a basic level of what is the subsidy, what is it doing, how much are you actually giving to foreign suppliers who are coming in, because you can't base it on a value-added basis. Firms with very low value-added have a huge incentive to come in and conduct their business. So that's one, just in terms of the structure of the subsidy. In terms of the included sectors and the excluded sectors, the government has been very specific about having a few specifically targeted sectors, and I think food processing and electronics are maybe two of the very high on that list, and there's of course many other excluded sectors, and it's absolutely an issue that resources are going to get dragged into the subsidized sectors and will be dragged out of the other sectors. As a general matter, can this policy of a PLI be the basis for kind of long-term thinking about how we're going to dramatically accelerate manufacturing? I agree completely that this cannot be the case, right? So we cannot rely upon this one policy to sort of incentivize, as it were, massive expansion of India's manufacturing footprint, exports in manufacturing footprint. Certainly not. But I still have a bit of hope that in demonstrating and sort of changing the narrative a little bit, sort of India as being a problematic place in which to do manufacturing, corruption, and all these kind of business nuisances that prevented people from coming to India in the past, just some signaling value. Maybe there's something there, maybe there's some demonstration effect that pays off. I'm not confident that it will, but I'm hopeful slightly that maybe this will be the way that things might eventually shape up.
So one last question, and then we open it up. This relates to, Poonam, what you said on manufacturing, and it ties into what you have been saying, and a lot of the paper from Devashish and Mary, lovely, had excellent presentations on this whole issue as well. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I sort of do hold the view myself that, unless manufacturing begins to do better, I mean, services are doing well, and Swami made that point yesterday that, this is where the trade is expanding quite rapidly. And certainly, I think, there's a lot of truth to what Swami said. Only point at which I sort of disagree with him is that that's an output issue, but when it comes to employment issue, the services that are actually generating the export revenues, their employment potential is not as much. And for the particularly, if I have to worry about the workers in agriculture, which have to transition out of agriculture into industry and services, then I think you need a different kind of manufacturing to do very well also, which is the kind of labor-intensive manufacturing. And in general, Poonam, you pointed out that at least as of now, manufacturing seems to be not responding very well, which is a bit puzzling. So I don't know in this case, usually I have some speculation as to why this may be happening and what may be the way, going forward, why I think, things would get better and all. But in this case, I don't even understand why this slowdown in manufacturing. I mean, this is really significant slowdown. Why has that happened? I mean, some of it is related to COVID, but as we're coming out of COVID, other sectors have picked up. Even, the most contact-intensive sectors like transportation, travel, hotels, restaurants, all that has picked up a lot better. But manufacturing seems not to have.
So I will...
And also, try to say, what else can the government, in terms of policies, if you see anything, that ought to be done?
Yeah. So let me first point out to the year 2019-20, when growth rate had slowed down to 4 or little below 4%. And that's the year we looked at the data very, very carefully at NCER. And we tried to unbundle that slowdown into sectors and try to look at the factors which contributed to that slowdown. So in 2019-20, the year before COVID hit, manufacturing sector growth rate was negative. And we looked at the disaggregated manufacturing, tried to look at the reasons for which it happened, and we could find 2 potential reasons why manufacturing sector contracted that year. One was the global slowdown in growth, and India's export growth rate of merchandise was negative that year. The other was the crisis in the NBFC sector, and therefore credit being a problem for manufacturing sector. Now, it seems that for the last 3 years, and particularly this year, when COVID is more or less over, and as you mentioned, various kinds of services sector are doing well, those 2 factors do not apply this year. So this year seems different, and the reasons are perhaps not related to the kind of reasons we saw in 2019-20. And one will have to do detailed analysis to see what exactly happened. So I think Q3 data shows negative growth rate of manufacturing sector, right? Overall year's estimate is 0.6%, which means it's not that manufacturing sector has started to pick up. I don't have a very good reason, but 2 more points. One is that perhaps a lot more needs to be now done at the state level, exactly how Karnataka and Tamil Nadu are attracting industries. So states will just have to understand the reason why their sectors or specific sectors are not doing well, perhaps center sitting where it is, and with the mandate to work on more broad brush issues such as labor, land, trade policy, exchange rate, banking may not be able to resolve those issues which are being felt on the ground. It's perhaps not very constructive in what I said, but I don't have anything else to say. Structurally, in the medium term, we know the challenges. Challenges are skills, challenges are female participation in labor force, challenges are being integrated in the global market, and FDI is something, and we'll discuss how the current account deficit is not really the only constraint on it. So there are 2 more things that can be done. One is the total capital inflow that country attracts. There is a mix of portfolio and FDI. perhaps larger share of FDI and lesser portfolio flow, which is very, very volatile in any case. Second is you can attract more capital inflows and let some of it be accumulated in reserves. The rest is current account deficit. So for example, if you attract FDI, total capital flow to the tune of 5%, let portfolio flow be only 0.5%, let's say hypothetically. Let's 4.5% your current account deficit, you may be comfortable with only 2.5%. The rest can be your capital foreign reserves accumulation. So there are ways it can be done, and eventually the hope is that current account deficit will improve because of this foreign direct investment. So one can be a little tolerant in the interim to let that current account deficit expand a little bit. But on services sector, as Swami said, and as the previous work that I have done shows, it's a highly heterogeneous and large sector. Some parts of services, actually in terms of its employment intensity and skill intensity, are very similar to labor-intensive manufacturing sector. And the sector has been doing well, services sector, and the interlinkages have likely become even deeper. The only issue with the services sector, Swami, is that the global market, as you point out, that globally we are doing very well in increasing our share in the global supply of services. That market is a fraction of total merchandise market. So sooner or later we'll hit the limit. We are already at 4.5% of the global market. I don't know how much more we can increase there. So therefore, if we want to tap into the global demand, then merchandise exports is the way to go about it. I won't be too dismissive about the potential of the services sector because it's a large and heterogeneous sector, but 17% of the economy cannot become stagnant. It has to grow, and it has to grow at the rates that East Asian countries have. And I don't know the reasons why it's not doing well, but it has to do well for India to go to 8 to 10%.
Can I say one thing on that as well, Arvind? So in terms of the mysteries of Indian manufacturing and lack of success, one of the other things that struck me is over the years, and you've been one of the pioneers in this area of just sort of thinking through what are the binding constraints on manufacturing growth. So mostly from a regulation standpoint, there are labor regulations that we worried a lot about, that these are kind of, these bind the size of firms, land regulations, various other things, credit constraints that create sort of binding constraints for firms in terms of the expansion of the manufacturing sector. And these are all true. These are changing in some level, but these have all generally been true. The mystery for me is when I look at Indian trade data. So if you look at the customs transactions data on Indian trade, you're going to see roughly in a year, maybe there are about 100,000 to 150,000 entities that are exporting from India, roughly 100,000 of any significance. But of those, the top 1,000 account for maybe 90% of India's exports. And the top 500 of those, meaning of the total, account for maybe 75, 80%. Okay? So in a sense, and these are firms that they're already beyond the labor constraint. They're already beyond the 100, 300, whatever it is. So the labor regulations of India are not a binding constraint for these firms. These are obviously very large and successful operators. So I imagine for most part they're not credit constrained. They're also highly successful in the Indian system, so they know how to maneuver their way around Indian regulations on land or the environment or whatever it is. They can get done. So why are these 500 firms, top 500, not expanding more? Why are the top 1,000? All of what we've discussed in the past many times, things that constrain firms in India, are more or less not relevant to these guys. And yet they have not grown despite low wages in India, the changes in the regulatory environment, so many other things that have become more favorable, infrastructure and so forth. So for me, that's a mystery as well, in terms of what is actually happening and why we aren't seeing expansion on that margin. There could be a whole another question about why is it that small firms aren't becoming bigger and succeeding in their exports, but why aren't the big firms expanding and exporting more?
I think it's a very, very good question. I don't know what the real answer is, but that's something. I mean, one of the things to do if your data allows you to identify the sectors.
Oh yeah.
I think you can look into. I mean, then because these are such large firms, you probably would know from the data by looking at them which firms are these.
No, the data has the name of the firms as well.
You know even the firms.
You know the firms.
So then you can ask the firms. I mean, meaning that, I mean, this is one of the ways I like to think about,
Yes.
ultimately, those, I mean, why are they not choosing to become larger?
Yeah.
And I think that's something very worthwhile to because, some sort of pattern, if it emerges, then you know what the broader answer is. So that's something I think very worthwhile to do. Okay, so we will open it up. Particularly, can I invite you, Mary, and give us a little bit more of what you said yesterday on what can what can India do to I think when you presented this broader one, how much was going to Vietnam, how much was going to some of the other Asian countries and all. Perhaps if you can shed some light of what you would tell India to do to do better. What is Vietnam doing so much better than India? What is it that they are getting right and India is not getting right?
I have a quick follow-up question for Mary as well on that, which is in your study and observation of China, Vietnam, etc., was it the case that the success was largely driven by small firms expanding over time and getting bigger, or was it already large firms that are just expanding their footprint? The size distribution of the export story.
Thank you for the questions. First, I will say I'm very humble about this because India is not my area of expertise, so I'll offer that first to say whatever I say that is of use, good. My mistakes, forgive. So I just really actually have some questions, which is, to what extent has India tried subsidies for foreign direct investment that are targeted to sectors in which it wants to grow? I know that India has engaged in extensive reform of its FDI regime, but what we have looked at and what we've seen in really digging into the Chinese experience is that while China is often credited with removing requirements on equity shares, they almost always move those sectors immediately into preferential treatment. So it's a preferential kind of liberalization. Oftentimes they had equity share constraints and preferences on at the same time. So I think preferences in this setting, mostly into SEZs that allowed them to subsidize entry. And we know there's a big fixed cost to exporting. We were discussing this before. And so, or big fixed cost to entry into a new market, so that these entry subsidies seem to matter. So I'm interested in what the Indian experience has been with that. On the Vietnamese experience, of course, some part of that was, as we show, just changes in Vietnamese fundamentals, their ability to somehow make reforms even within a basically authoritarian context. That led to the development of the manufacturing sector. This is prior to the positive geopolitical push that they've gotten from being able to join CPTPP, and then the U.S. animosity toward China and the tariffs. Another piece, though, has come from their access to the American market. So their ability to penetrate the American market exceeds even their ability to penetrate the rest of the world. And that, of course, is due to the tariffs. You see that starting around 2017, 2018, when Trump puts on the tariffs. And part of that is in fact, due to the entry of multinationals and the entry of subcontractors from other parts of the world, and the movement of capital from China to Vietnam to avoid the tariffs. Now, it's legit in the sense that the manufacturing is being done in Vietnam, but nevertheless, it's due to their proximity and relationship with the Chinese. So that is part of the story, but not the whole story. A lot of this is driven by multinationals who make decisions about subcontractors. We have to remember that Apple may make decisions, but it's operating through its subcontractors. So they're really the touch points here. Lastly, you asked about, your last question was about size distribution. In China, definitely the foreign companies that come in are bigger. what we saw up until about 2012 was very rapid entry and exit. And so you had rapid growth of new entrants who were going to be successful and pretty quick exit of those that were not, and then exit of smaller, older companies that weren't going to grow and basically over time had become uncompetitive. Interestingly, since 2012, that process has really, really slowed down. And Chinese productivity growth as a result has really, really slowed down. So one of the big keys there is having the ability to have this dynamic sector and having the social supports that allow that to be consistent with the political economy of a democratic society. So this is one of the problems we get when we get subsidies, which is that no politician wants a company that is subsidized to go out of business. We certainly saw that in the United States with Obama and the solar company that they subsidized, and the tremendous political backlash that he took when that company declared bankruptcy. So I think you do have this need to have rapid entry and growth, but also when you're getting into the business of subsidization and very active industrial policy, it's how do you admit that some things aren't going to work? So there's also an exit problem with subsidization. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Okay, the floor is open. Devashish?
All right, I have a combination of questions and comments. So Poonam, when you said demography is on our side, I wonder whether we have a demographic dividend or a demographic curse, in the sense that the challenge has not been to find people to fill up all the jobs we have, but the challenge has been to create all the jobs, create enough jobs for all the people in India. So, so that's my first question. The second question is, you've tried to talk about it a little bit, but, what is and Pravin raised this issue about the binding constraint. Do you think, not enough tariff reforms is a binding constraint, or is it domestic is it domestic regulation? So, by pushing for trade reforms through, say, FTAs, are we in turn also pushing for reforms of domestic regulations? Because the more competition you face on external markets, that would actually put pressure on our policymakers for domestic reforms. So you might not be able to get the domestic reforms directly, but maybe you enter these trade regulations, and then that kind of creates more pressure for domestic reforms. Pravin, you mentioned this thing about how are firms in Bangladesh and Vietnam that different from firms in India. I guess average firm size would be quite different. At least the work that Rana has done with Carl Jandok at the ADB showed that the concentration of labor-intensive firms was mainly in this, in that size range of under 20 worker firms in India, while in China it was 1,000+ worker firms, which is a big difference. But also, Bangladesh and Vietnam, are the labor markets very different? Are the labor markets more flexible? I think, Vietnam probably would be more flexible. I don't know that much about Bangladesh. And in Vietnam, the average education levels are much higher. And a lot of it has been achieved through this, they had this bilateral trade agreement with the US in 2001, and they had access to the US markets. And that, expansion of their export markets created incentives for both individuals to actually acquire more education, but also for the government to actually invest more in education. So that basically, this is an example of, domestic policy changes being driven by the size of the export market. That, you first had the trade reform, the trade agreement, and that pushed Vietnam to make some changes at the domestic level. the Apple subsidies you talked about, Praveen, 5% subsidy, you're getting like 5% in terms of value added addition. So, it's a wash. So at some point, those subsidies will expire. I mean, I hope so. I mean, normally things don't, which are supposed to be temporary, end up being permanent, but I'm hoping that they will be, they will be discontinued at some point. But so the hope is you do it for 5 years, you don't make, there's no net gain for 5 years, but then another 45 years you're going to gain something out of that investment. But on top of that, even if that 5% is a wash today, there's this additional employment creation, which is of value by itself. So, so that's something to think about. Regarding PLI, we need to kind of be very clear about what the objective function is. What are we trying to achieve? And depending on that, we can, the PLI can be selective about sectors. I don't know whether that would be against WTO rules or not. And the last point is about labor intensive. Arvind, when you mentioned that our shares in our shares in manufacturing exports is very low, and so low that you can just get some out of China's shares. This is even more stark when you look at labor-intensive manufacturers. So, just supporting your point on that.
Yeah, Amyata? Also, by the way, since you are the expert on digitization, illuminate us on how that is.
No, I had a question.
Apart from the quantitative exercise you have done
More broadly, and I wish Viral was here, but my question, I think it relates to all this issue of capacity to manufacture. From capacity to finance that growth. If you look at, for example, the largest banks of the world, just by sheer size, we're talking about the size distribution in manufacturing sector, and Praveen said that you don't grow beyond a point. But if you look at your financial, I don't think even the State Bank of India is one of the top 50 banks of the world. So if we are thinking about that scale of manufacturing and that scale of presence in the real sector, the financial sector has to come hand in hand. Now, there's a lot that's happening on digitization and a bunch of other stuff, but in terms of building up that capacity where we have large scale ability to fund huge companies, I think there's a problem. Now, there are many issues, legacy issues. We nationalized banks way back, and so all those things have a persistence over time. But our credit markets are very inefficient, by which I mean that the way that money flows in our system from a deposit to a credit and what gets eaten in the process of intermediation, we don't really do that well compared to the rest of the economy that we would like to be at. And manufacturing, that is all that eats a lot of credit, I think. If you have inefficient market, and Arvind was talking about if there are unintended consequences of PLI giving you capital in inefficient sector, then it's not solving that problem, it's making perhaps that problem worse. So just remarks, but any thoughts on how you think about financing capacity to help boost trade capacity?
There's somebody behind, was there? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Actually, I came from the business school. They have a very interesting conference on Indian business, and people from McKinsey and one of the biggest IP firms are there, and they're talking about it. And it's very interesting because they talk from the practical point of view, and here's the theory, so it's very interesting. One of the things that I mentioned was most of the businesses there are based on individual trust. That's a personal trust, and there's no institutions that promote, frictionless negotiation, frictionless investment structures, and maybe that's one of the reasons why. Number two, I raised the point yesterday about contract enforcement, and according to the World Bank, property rights, contract enforcement, registering a business, starting a business. India is like between 113 to 165, which is a very low. Other sectors like having construction, electricity, they are very high, like 25, 26. So maybe that's the question. My other point of question is, in terms of the quadruple helix model of growth, which involves private sector, industry, universities, what's the coordination there, especially when you want to go into the global value chain and upgrade within that value chain, and when you do smart specialization, as you said, you need the human capital, but also the coordination between government and industry and business so that you invest in research and development and everything. That's what America is doing, that's what China is doing. Do you see that structure there, or is there incentive problems, or what's the issue there? Thank you.
Take Isha, and so then we come back to the panelists.
So following up on Amitosh's point on the relationship between finance and trade, I was wondering if capital controls also play a role. So these exporting firms probably have exposure in foreign currency on the asset side, and in order to hedge that exposure, they have to have some foreign currency funding on the liability side itself. And if they were to get this funding from abroad, I wonder if capital controls are preventing them from hedging their exposures, which is preventing them from expanding.
So let me start with Devashish on the comparison with Vietnam and Bangladesh and the size distribution of firms and so on. So my point actually on that, Devashish, was that you already have firms in India in each of these sectors that we would be curious about, textiles and footwear and so forth, they're low skill intensive, which are large beyond the regulation, right? So if you're a small firm, you might need to worry about, what if I cross 10 or 50 or 100 because I'm going to be hit by a new regulatory problem. But you're past that problem when you're at 500 already, okay, or 1,000. And so why aren't you the one that's growing then? Okay, so a firm that's 5 is concerned, but you could have a different industrial structure potentially in India. You do have this kind of monopolization at the top end in terms of who's exporting, like the top 500, 1,000 firms in India. So it's a bit of a question. I'm not saying I know the answer to that. It's not automatic that it's just because they have more flexible labor markets in Vietnam that, this is the reason for their success. And that being said, on top of it, there is also the issue that informal labor arrangements in India are quite pervasive. And my colleague Ritam Chori, who got his PhD from here on that topic, has written quite a bit about the rapid expansion of the use of informal labor that does somehow not subject to these rules and so forth. So it's not as if even necessarily their firms are hugely constrained where they wanted to find a way out. There's possibly a way out of that, at least the labor regulation part of it. The second piece that you mentioned, I completely agree. So a big part of Vietnam's success has been the free trade agreement with the US, and a big part of Bangladesh's success has been the free trade agreement with the European Union. And that actually was sort of the point I was making, which is that at some underlying structural level, it's perhaps not the case. I guess I'd be curious to find out, but perhaps not the case that they're vastly different from India in some sense. They've had these special arrangements with the EU and the US that's allowed a certain sort of expansion of growth of their exports. And in a causal sense, it's very clear. Bangladesh gets the EBA access to the European markets, exports start taking off. So much so, by the way, that Arvind and I were talking about this yesterday, Indian textile exporters, rather than export from India, would rather go to Bangladesh, get a made in Bangladesh stamp put on their textile exports, and have it be sent to the European Union. Much like when the Trump tariffs got put on China, at least a few, and Mary was talking about this yesterday, and we were earlier too. Chinese exporters who would rather get a made in Vietnam stamp as a way of evading kind of the Trump tariffs did a bit of that as well. That doesn't necessarily explain all of what was going on in Vietnam, but there's an incentive to do that. So if Indian exporters are good enough from a cost perspective to kind of take their business to Bangladesh and then send it to the US, surely we should be able to send it directly from India as well, in a certain sense. Let's see, what was the other question about assets and liabilities, mismatches, and so forth, foreign exchange? I'm not sure I know that much about that, honestly. It's a good question. I wonder if the very large firms in India, the ones that are doing most of the exporting, that they're subject to these problems in the same way that a smaller firm might be. Okay? Maybe they are. And it would be interesting to study. And maybe they're not, and it's not a concern, but that's a good point. Am I missing something? There was a question about just broader aspects about kind of coordination between industry and academia and human capital formation and government regulations and so forth. So of course it's taking place at some level, and it's very likely not, it's suboptimal relative to what it could be. But whether that's the binding constraint to Indian manufacturing growth, I'm not sure. Meaning we perhaps could go some significant distance before that sort of thing becomes much more crucial. Just in a way, even property rights, I mean, in the end, if you look at Chinese, the phenomenal growth of Chinese exports, I mean, what sense of property rights do you have in China necessarily, or kind of, contract enforcement and so forth, at least on paper, in a way that would get captured by the doing business with indicators, right? If you look at doing business with indicators, China is actually not that high on the list, okay? And yet, obviously, in fact, a fantastic record of success. I'm not saying that's not an argument not to improve the property right regime in India or contract enforcement in India, but maybe it's not as much of a binding constraint as one might imagine it to be. Perhaps. Yes and no. I mean, it's not even 100% control.
So let me take some of them. So Debashish's demography is potential dividend. Whether we leverage it or not is up to us. It's not a curse as yet. It's keeping wages low. But if we can get our act together, then it can become a source of competitive advantage. Having said that, the two issues with our demography. One is that population is now projected to peak out in 2030, sooner than we ever expected. So this dividend will remain with us in the sense that population will remain young for nearly 2 more decades. But the size of population is going to shrink eventually. And I was joking with somebody, maybe that is the solution to our unemployment challenge, that we just stop producing fewer babies. The other is skill is a huge challenge, right? I mean, whichever employer you talk to, there are people, but they are not skilled. They may have degrees, but they are not skilled. And it's our opportunity to turn our population base into an opportunity by skilling them. So when we talk about exports of goods and services, I always tell them goods, services, and labor. Let's skill our people and start exporting them. And one example is become the nursing capital of the world, right? Aging population in advanced economies, they do not have people to serve them. And India has that opportunity. It's an English-speaking population, discipline, can be skilled and can be sent out. So long as we consider it as an opportunity, we are so fixated on exporting manufacturing that we don't talk about other opportunities which we need to leverage simultaneously. On banking being an inefficient intermediary, you're right to some extent that a couple of things I want to mention here, Amyutosh, and you can think about how to bring them together. So we have two kinds of banks, right? We have private banks and public sector banks. They both have to lend a huge share of their portfolio to the government. So yesterday when Subbu was saying that there's crowding in because government is spending on infrastructure, there is definite crowding out as well. In addition, private sector is happy to lend to the service sector and for personal loans. Private sector banks, they don't want to lend to the manufacturing sector. Public sector banks should not be lending to manufacturing sector because when they lend, they run NPLs, right? But one more, anecdote here is that when we SBI is an exception, as we always say. So we were talking to some industrialists in India at 2 different forums, and large players, and they say that cost of financing is not a problem for them. Cost of financing has come down, and SBI lends to them. I'll tell you the name later, one-on-one. So when we ask them, what are the challenges you're facing, cost of financing is not one of them. The challenges that we hear about are actually still regulations and clearances at the grassroots level. Despite the fact that a lot has been done through rules, implementation, cost of logistics, on which now a lot is happening, market access, right? Who do we produce for? And skills, R&D. These are the challenges we hear. And we hear that we are not sure that even after doing all this, whether we'll be competitive globally. So the kind of challenges we hear have kind of moved on, Banking sector, cost of financing is not one of those challenges that we have heard. The other question is, the scale that we are talking about, and until the banking sector reaches that scale, is bank the right kind of financing arrangement for these firms, or should they be tapping the capital market? And therefore, in my mind, FDI seems like a win-win. Initially, when you're trying to get a whole lot of things together, FDI can take care of some of them, which is technology and financing and market access, as it has done for other countries. On hedging for foreign exposure, RBI is providing the best hedge. It keeps the exchange rate fairly stable. And actually, one reason is that exactly because hedging market is very thin, and they don't want to add that cost. So no matter how much some of the economists talk about, depreciate your exchange rate, let it move with the market, RBI is very clear. If you look at the real exchange rate, it seems almost as if they're targeting the real exchange rate. So that is the best hedge, I would say. That's not a constraint either. There are more bread and butter kind of issues about, setting up something new and scaling it up. Scaling has not been easy, and that's the main challenge.
Okay. Just one thing in response to Devashish. So Devashish, on the PLI thing and the temporariness of the policy, for now it's announced as there's a kind of a 5-year outlay, and in a sense your question is right. The subsidy runs out in 5 years, so you pay the 5-year cost and maybe you can get a 50-year benefit. But that really is a function of what the nature of that industry is, right? Is it a very footloose industry where 5 years later somebody else is giving you a subsidy in some other part of the world and you leave? Or is it that you've made a huge capital investment and so you're stuck, in a sense, in the country, and then you got the 5-year subsidy and you deliver a longer-term benefit? So it's not clear, at least from what's already happening, how footloose or not the industries are, right? So as I understand it, some big number, I haven't confirmed it, but some big part of this outlay is for a semiconductor fab, which would be a very heavy investment, $20 billion, and maybe the Indian government is paying a significant fraction of that, and that could yield long-term benefits, but some of the other assembly, mobile phone assembly sort of platforms, etc., maybe they're there today and not there tomorrow.
Okay. Just, just a couple of things that were left I will pick up. Mary, I think we don't subsidize FDI. And I think for economists, it's very difficult to actually make that case. So there's just a quick answer to you. On Devashish's question on trade reform leading to domestic reform, one excellent example from recent experience of the entry of Foxconn. They have actually forced a labor reform in Karnataka state by insisting that we will come in only on the condition that Karnataka allows 2 12-hour shifts instead of 3 8-hour shifts, and that a night shift for women is permitted. So this is a very good example of how if a large player is entering, it can actually help force. And once that, obviously this reform, when it's done, it's not only for that particular firm that's entering, but for everybody else in Karnataka, and it may then spread to other states as well. So I think that's something very good. Last thing I actually wanted to say is about the exchange rate itself. Poonam defended it as saying that the RBI is providing the hedge, but I personally feel that RBI has been keeping the exchange rate too overvalued. And not letting it depreciate as much as it needs to let it depreciate. I personally think, this question never came up actually in this whole discussion, but I personally think that the exchange rate has been one of the key factors impacting adversely the Indian exports. If you look at that past history from 2003 to 2011, when exports of merchandise exports expanded sixfold from $50 billion to $300 billion in 9 years' time. I don't think any other variable has moved that rapidly actually in a short period of time. Exchange rate was extremely important. Between 1991 and 2002, rupee had moved from something like 13, 14 rupees to a dollar to about 45 rupees to a dollar. And that similar kind of movement the RBI has not allowed to happen. And inflation rate certainly overall in India has been significantly higher than inflation rate outside. Therefore, the real exchange rate has been, RBI's own indices of real exchange rate actually show that the rupee has been appreciating in real terms. But there is no constituency for depreciation, I must say. The government likes a strong dollar. We also sort of defend that and all. But I think that exchange, that rupee, the exchange rate, I think is extremely important. And China, in fact, as well as before that, South Korea and Taiwan, they very successfully, let the. It's not a question of continuous depreciation or something. It's a level which ends up counting quite a lot. Where do you? Even if you're defending it for a while. What is the level at which the rupee to dollar exchange rate is fixed? I think that seems to play a very important role. So, okay, with that, I think formally at least, we will bring this session to the close. A couple of things. First, I want to thank, all my organizers. Mona is not here, but Vivek, there are, Arundhati, Piyush, and we had others, but anyway, so.
The mic.
All of you, there you go. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And yesterday we had Jagannath. So thank you all. I think it was an admirable job, fantastic. You've done it absolutely wonderfully. Vivek and Mona especially, who have been, I think, on a longer term, have been involved in organizing this whole, as all of you who have organized would know how this is a complicated exercise we have to do. And practically except for cancellation of the two participants from India, and this last one actually, Viral, I just saw in my email he had missed his flight, or the flight got delayed. Actually, he didn't miss it, but flight got delayed, and that was the reason he's not here. But other than that, I think everything has gone smoothly. I'm just assuming that those of you who have traveled and been staying at hotels, etc., stay has been all right. None of you has complained to me, but that may be just politeness, but thank you in that case. And if things have gone well, then thank you all on this side. One last thing that Vivek has told me is that he would like to get a photograph of all the speakers, chairs, session chairs, and discussants together. So if they will actually come to the stage, we can have that photograph.